Hello, everyone, and welcome to this discussion about the emerging trends in development research in Europe and elsewhere. I have a pleasure to have Professor Henning Melber to discuss with me. My name is Tiina Kontinen, and I'm from the University of Jyväskylä from Finland. And today we are going to discuss what are the emerging trends in development research. Henning Melber is the president of the European Association for Development Research and Training Institutes, EADI, and research associate in the Nordic Africa Institute in Uppsala, Sweden. He is an editor or co-editor of over 50 books and author of over, 250 articles. We have stopped counting by now. And he has also very particular history with Africa. So I would like to invite Professor Melber to tell something about yourself. How would you like to introduce yourself to our African audience?
Thank you, Tiina, or rather Kitos in your language, and Karibu to everyone listening in East Africa. I feel very honored by the privilege to share some thoughts with you, and I hope it triggers some fruitful deliberations, which I'm sure you also will have without my inputs. As Tiina mentioned, while my dialect betrays me that I'm of German origin, I grew up in Namibia at a time when it was still a white settler colony. And since I considered Namibia as my home, I decided to join the anti-colonial movement in 1974. That was at a time where it was not considered to be opportunistic to change the sides, so to say. As a result, I was exiled, had to live in Germany, and I returned at independence to Namibia. I was heading a local think tank offering policy advice to the new independent government, and got into some conflict with my comrades over what I would dub the limits to liberation. I very strongly felt that we did not live up to the values we promised, because the majority of the people in Namibia today remain poor and marginalized as they were before. That doesn't mean we haven't achieved anything, but we haven't achieved enough. And that actually leads, of course, also to the core of what is development. It's more than national sovereignty. What are we doing with national sovereignty? And I will come to that in a moment, just to explain why I'm now sitting in Uppsala, entering that conversation. By the end of the 1990s, I became very critical of the limits to liberation. And that was the situation where the Nordic Africa Institute in Uppsala was looking for a research director, and they invited me to apply. So it offered me an opportunity to start a new chapter in life when I was about to turn 50, and I accepted that offer. And since 20 plus years, I'm living with my family in Sweden, remain Namibian at heart, remain also visibly present in Namibia, much to the annoyance of my comrades who have never kicked me out of SWAPO. I'm speaking as a card-bearing SWAPO member. And so I'm having multiple hats, so to say, which also relate to the concept of development and identities in the plural. I'm the first one, based on my individual experiences, to be convinced with what most of you or all of you experience daily with your individual backgrounds, that there is no singular identity. There are always identities. And we always are confronted with the challenge to make choices. Which side are we on? There are certain experiences we cannot make. I will never know what it means to be Black. I will never know how it feels with my daughter, who is a person of color because her mother is a Black Namibian. I will never know what it means to be a woman. I will never know what it means to be LGBTI. But I know that they all, based on human rights and liberties, deserve solidarity and empathy. Even if empathy might be limited with people where you do not feel their pain. That comes again back to a notion of development. Development is nothing neutral. And I guess most of you who are engaged in development and decided to choose it as a topical issue for your academic career, for your profession, did not only so because you thought, oh, that's a clever career path to make loads of money and an upward mobility where I become a professor or I become a head of a ministerial department. No, most of you, I would assume, made that decision based on your values. I would assume you fill development with certain substantive core elements. They relate to improvement of well-being in a material sense. They also improve human rights. They are based on recognition of otherness. It's basically a search to improve the living conditions of most people in the world. I say most people and not all, because we are living in skewed asymmetric power structures where wealth is unfairly distributed. And unfortunately, the minority which benefits from the wealth amassed, in most cases, with very few exceptions, has not realized that sharing parts of the wealth would be in their own best interest. That applies to a global elite and it applies to a local elite. And I'm sure whether you are in Zambia or in Tanzania or in any other country, not only on the African continent, also elsewhere, you will have numerous examples that come to your mind where the local or national or the global elite is just too stupid to realize that sharing would be in the best of their interest. So, Tiina, allow me to come back looking at what development is about. You made reference to EADI, the European Association for Development Research and Training Institutes. And I'm proud to say that EADI is a value-based association, which has European in its name because it has member institutions and individuals from Europe, but it's not Eurocentric. It has different perspectives, and they include value-based perspectives. And it also means to provide space and a forum to discuss new challenges, to engage with new buzzwords, which are more than just buzzwords, which stand maybe even for paradigm shifts, which stand for challenging the old, traditional, still much established notion of development, which has a long history going back to the era of Enlightenment, where the notion of development was associated with progress and progress associated with the civilizing mission, which was translated into European dominance of the world. Development was understood of uplifting, in quotes, unquotes, other people in other parts of the world to the level of the Europeans. In the 21st century, confronted with the fatal consequences of the Anthropocene, we feel it the hard way, very painfully, what that notion of development meant, not only for the people in the global south, which for generations and generations were exploited, humiliated, dehumanized, executed in forms of genocidal practices, robbed of their natural resources, their own lives basically made a commodity, starting with the slave trade. Not only for them. In the year 2022, we know we have put at risk the future of our children and their children wherever they are in the world. We have lived at the costs not only of others, but at the risk of life on Earth. So while development can be considered actually a neutral term, it was always abused with a power of definition, which applied a certain trajectory at the expense of the majority of the people in this world, but not only of people, but also nature in a wider sense. We need to address that. The message has arrived in the North to some extent, as COP27 shows, while we still have others who are stubborn and deny the effects of this development as it's manifested in climate change. But one of the buzzwords that emerged already 20 years ago, when the writing was long at the wall, was degrowth. Finding developmental trajectories which are not based on fossil-based energies, on the way of production which creates profits and surplus, but to look into other ways how you can reproduce societies in a truly sustainable way with a long-term perspective. And concepts of indigenous people were more discussed than ever before. From Latin America, the Peruvian highlands, but also from Nepal and other places, from India. There are numerous examples, of course, also from African societies, including also philosophical notions such as Ubuntu, which is a very humanitarian approach to development. So that would be one of the issues which certainly the last 2 decades gained ground. Pluriverse and conviviality are related notions to degrowth because they are based on the awareness and the insight that there are different approaches to how best to reproduce societies and how best to recognize otherness on the shared values of all being human. There is a notion of post-developmentalism, which gained ground since the 1990s and even more dynamics since the turn of the century. Post-developmentalism, to some extent, entered a trap or a pitfall because it created the misleading impression as if you leave development behind, post-developmentalism. Well, actually, it reinforced the notion of development, which is okay as long as you don't pretend you would not, by saying we need another understanding of development. And that brings me back to what I said earlier. Development is actually a neutral term. It's not loaded. It's just how it was filled and who applies the power of definition. And it might be one of the discussions you have in your institutions, how to go about giving meaning to the notion and concept of development. To pass on in discussions, what do we refer to when we talk about development? Another notion, which goes back to the 1960s and 1970s, but in a different context, is decoloniality. That in the development studies discourse, more and more scholars became aware that development studies very uncritically were based on concepts of modernization, misunderstanding decolonization as passing national sovereignty from a minority regime of European colonial powers to local elites. Meanwhile, in most cases, they reproduced the structures they inherited. Mwalimu might have been an exception, but as you, I would assume, know better than I, he failed. Sometimes people a bit flippantly say he was maybe the only true socialist in East Africa, because he really believed in the ideas and he was serious about these ideas, despite the fact that it might be debatable if they were translated into policy in the best possible way. Because you need to convince people not based on force, but by the sake of arguments and the insights. This is where Frantz Fanon and the Wretched of the Earth, by the way, comes into the picture, because he makes constant reference to the need to mobilize the masses. And he also says in the Wretched of the Earth, if you need years to convince the people where to go to, it's a good investment. You should not save time, because that is the wrong way to do it. So decoloniality is still one of the major challenges. And I like a very flippant remark the Ugandan scholar Mahmoud Mamdani once made at a panel debate, where he said, the only post-colonial I know is the post office. While it's a bit of a flippant remark, it very much highlights a dilemma. When we discuss health systems, education, civil service, other forms how societies are reproduced best through institutions, then we will realize rather sooner than later that institutions and structures were not decolonized. To replace one curriculum by another one, which happened all over, and then maybe by a new heroic narrative, then you reproduce a way of transferring knowledge which existed before. That's not true decolonization. That's Bankier's knowledge, as Paulo Freire called it. And this reference to Mwalimu, to Frantz Fanon, to Paulo Freire, and I could list many others, Walter Rodney in his seminal book 50 years ago, reminding us how Europe underdeveloped Africa. All of that has been said. We are not reinventing the wheels. It's just that the time has come where we are made more aware about the needs to seriously engage and reflect. And when it comes to decoloniality, it needs to be stressed that decolonization is no metaphor, which leads me to epistemology. If you bear with me that I have 2-3 more minutes to talk about it. We have a new discourse about epistemologic injustice and the need to decolonize. That's fair enough. It can't do any harm. But again, it offers pitfalls. And you might end in a trap if you create the belief that changing names or removing monuments is decolonization. You engage with symbolism, but renaming Swaziland into Eswatini makes absolutely no difference for the people ruled by King Mswati. Absolutely no difference. They are not better off. Maybe some of them feel a little bit better in their human dignity, but when it comes to the day-to-day challenges, it makes no difference. And for the beggar who sits on a street in Johannesburg, which is renamed from Peter Retief Straat into Nelson Mandela Avenue, makes not a lot of difference if he doesn't get more money or other support in his misery. For the students at UCT who removed the Rhodes statue, it was a success, it was a victory. But I dare to say that while they now don't have to pass the statue, because of its removal, their examination results have not improved. They might feel better. It might help them to feel more dignified. That's all fine, but it points to the need. We need to transform material structures. The same applies to knowledge production. You all, that includes Tiina and the others in the North who are collaborating with you, are serious about decolonization, are serious about fighting asymmetric power relations. But we have such limited means. It starts with the general organization of funding of research, of funding of institutions, of basic salaries of you in the global South, of the way your research results are recognized and published in peer-reviewed journals, which are dominated by a handful of commercial publishing houses in the North. And I could go on and on and on. It's an uphill battle we are facing. And that is not to say it's a hopeless case, because then I would not sit here and engage with Tiina and you and talk now for already far too long about all the challenges. You can't win it if you're not in it. And we have all the reasons to fight these battles for us, for our students, you students, for our children, their children. We have limited time, and we need to find ways that development is taken serious in ways we understand development. And it's more than just a discourse. I think I've said enough, but I would like to quote from Melissa Leach, who was one of 4 participants in a roundtable which we held almost 2 weeks ago in London at an EADI directors meeting, which also Tiina attended, where we discussed development studies in times of multiple crises. And we all identified the crises and the challenges. Much of what I said was mentioned there. But I think it is important to end with how Melissa Leach ended her presentation. She's the director of IDS in Sussex. She has a very influential and powerful position also when it comes to policy advice, but she's not a sellout. And she ended with the following remark, I quote, "To end on an optimistic note, recasting development means being more critically engaged than ever, whilst also identifying, supporting, and being part of a politics of hope towards more equitable, resilient, inclusive futures." And that's offering some comfort, because it means as scholars and practitioners in development studies, we advocate hope. We try to represent a better future, ways out of the multiple crises. And I think I should stop there.
Thank you, Henning, for excellent thoughts about development and the kind of discussions that we have had about development. Maybe I would like to now ask some questions, maybe on behalf of my African colleagues who unfortunately are not here now, but will be listening this later on. As you said, that kind of development has gains different meanings in different contexts and so on and so forth. And then if we look at, for example, your kind of reflections about economic growth and things related to that, I think that in our partner countries, for example, Zambia and Tanzania, and all over the Africa, economic growth is still something very important indicator or kind of goal of development in those countries, and development policies very much strive for economic growth. And also when we look at the ideas of development or kind of the processes of development, the Eurocentrism that you criticize is of course very very, very relevant discussions, but also, of course, then there are these kind of different examples of development pathways that are coming from China or Gulf countries that actually are quite influential in African countries. So I was just wondering that, do you think that there are still, is there kind of certain nuances or differences when we speak about what development means or should mean in our partner, I mean, in African countries and in our European discussions, or is it kind of shared agenda that you promoted?
Well, it's actually more than one question, what you just...
Sorry.
That's okay. Let me start with the trend in the last 20 years to new global governance structures and a reshaping of global markets, meaning, among others, China, not only as an emergent player, but as a manifest most important player in the world today, with other countries as well, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Turkey, the Arab Oil Emirates. So we have a multiple of actors that have changed the map in the 21st century. To be a bit provocative, I think in terms of economic relations from African perspectives, it hasn't changed a lot. There were policy changes where Europe is paying the price for being patronizing, paternalistic, and not realizing that they have to eat humble pie. The finger-wagging attitude of Europeans towards African countries is not a good way to enter mutual relations based on respect. And if you contrast it with China, there is a huge difference. And I think for the local elites in many African countries, that was a decisive difference. China rolled out the red carpet. They were treated like the same, even if everyone knows they are not. China said, we have a policy of non-intervention, which, as at least in Zambia is very well known, is not really true when you had election campaigns and the conditions of the miners in the copper belt was a topic. Then China did intervene in domestic affairs. But what it meant was, if your elites are corrupt, we don't mind. It's not our problem, which would be an issue of the European side who insists on good governance. Never mind that they are violating human rights all the time. So these double standards play out differently. And they played out in favor of a positive image of China, which allowed China to enter economic relations with many African countries as a serious competitor to Europe. I know, and I'm sure many in the region know, that this did not have the same positive effect on the ground. I remember I visited the World Social Forum in January 2007 in Nairobi. And I used the opportunity, as I often do. I asked the taxi driver, I said, how about the Chinese? And he said, they are just like the Indians. That said it all. It reproduced a sentiment, but it was based on the experiences of ordinary people. So that's the one part of the question you raised. Yes, there are differences, but when it comes to the interests of the new players, they are not different from the European interests. Access to natural resources, uranium, strategic minerals, investment in infrastructure, but for tenders where Chinese construction firms are executing the work. So overall, I think on balance, no matter which country it is from outside the continent, the trade-offs are not significantly different from African perspectives. That does not mean that policy is not important. That's why I started with the policy side. It also explains, if I may use that example, why Robert Mugabe remained until the very end, after Nelson Mandela, the most popular African head of state on the continent in every survey. That didn't apply to the Zimbabweans because they knew what it meant to live under Mugabe's regime. But wherever he went outside of Zimbabwe, people celebrated him because in his finger-wagging posture, he stood up to the West and said, "Who are you, Tony Blair? Who are you, George W. Bush, to tell me about human rights while you start wars in the rest of the world?" He said the right things for the wrong reason, because he said it to say, "Leave me in peace when I violate human rights." But two wrongs doesn't make a good. But he was applauded by other people because he stood up against the Western patronizing attitudes, which relates to what people on the continent have experienced for I don't know how many generations. Being humiliated, being looked down, that resonates, and it's important. And China has realized that. I'm afraid Europe hasn't realized that. They still have a long way to go. So that was the first part. The second part is there are more pitfalls. Seems to be one of the favorite words in our conversation. Looking at COP25 and other discussions, we need to be very careful that the old trajectories of economic development are not replaced by what seems to be new trajectories, but reinforce the old structures. All the talk about hydro energy, if you have a closer look, it's a new way for the industrialized societies to access energy from other societies. So who really benefits from the technology? So one needs to really look, what are the best possible deals and who sets the tune and the conditions? Tough negotiations are required. So one needs to be very careful that we are not reproducing old structural asymmetries in a new costume. That's tough because you are confronted with a well-oiled machinery on the other side of the table. They know their business, they are well trained, and very often on the African side of the table, you have a small team which negotiates in the WTO, in the AU, in, I don't know, the regional associations, in COP27, and they are totally overwhelmed by all the multiple tasks they have to face, which again is a sign of the asymmetric power relations, which have material phenomena. And that is a challenge. And it also means, coming back to development studies, how best can we approach that? And where do we find allies? Because the we-they divide is not any longer between the North and the South. In our times, the South has arrived in the North with a growing degree of destitution among people in the Northern societies, who are also victims of the same developmental trajectory. And as you know, when you look at the elites, the parasitic elites in the South, the North has arrived in the South because they are having a pact among elites. They are selling out natural resources for their own gains. The term is rent-seeking capitalism, with no trickle-down effects, with no meaningful employment creation, with no meaningful training of local expertise. So there are struggles which play out locally, but which are also global. And it reminds me of something. I quote old people, and it shows how old I am. Amilcar Cabral was in the early 1960s the leader of the PAIGC before his assassination, was in Italy asked, what is the best form of solidarity? And his answer was, the best form of solidarity is to fight the struggle in your own country. Which means there is an interlinkage. And we need to look for allies in all the countries of the world to put up a global struggle against global injustices. And that includes to challenge the resource-based developmental discourse, which tends to be reshaped and reintroduced in a new fashion, but reproducing the old inequalities.
Thank you. Now we have a few minutes to go, so I would like to go back to the question of development studies, and in this project we are discussing the needs of renewing the curricula of development studies and what kind of things should a graduate of development studies know. And for example, you mentioned the epistemological injustices and the kind of search for alternative theorizing and conceptualization of development. And also you mentioned the politics of hope that we should manage to give for the future generation of development scholars. So I would just like to ask you if you have any ideas. What do you think, as a kind of experienced scholar, that what would be the most important things that there should be in the curricula of development studies, not only in Africa, but everywhere?
Well, development studies have, of course, a hard fact side, which I haven't stressed, but maybe I should stress now. Of course, it's important to build schools, to reduce the walking distance of kids to schools. Of course, it's important to build water wells, to reduce the walking distance to get water. It's important to create infrastructure. This is hardcore development, as long as it is for the people to improve their daily living conditions. But that will be always an integral part of development studies. You should not forget about that aspect. You need, of course, to empower those who do development studies to be able to apply the available means for the best interest of the ordinary people. That's basically non-ideological in as far as, well, it concerns how you construct those infrastructural investments or how you organize efficient institutions. But already there, it comes on value-based issues. How do you reflect on hierarchies? How do you define competences? There was a time where barefoot medical people was an issue. So there are many, many notions related also to seemingly hardcore issues, which are softcore issues, but which have a fundamental impact on how you organize. So to create awareness and sensitivity for that. But also the way you organize the transmission of knowledge is actually creating knowledge. EADI has next year a general conference, and it uses the term new rhythms of development deliberately, because a lot of people might say, new rhythms of development? And what the call explains is art and expressions of creativity are forms of development. So development studies need to look and search what are means of creating and transferring knowledge which also enhance awareness of diversity, of respect for otherness, and using that potential for development in a way which we can identify with. So it's not only the curriculum, which is important, and the buzzwords are all there, and we talked about them, and the literature is there. You will easily find all the cross-references to that. Also the reminder how do we transfer that knowledge? Not only giving a list of references and the students read it and then they write an essay. No, there might be other forms and ways to interact at the university, but also outside of the university in field studies, which actually embrace a new understanding and concept of development. We need to keep in mind development is, at least the way we understand it so far, mainly about people. While I'm hastened to add, it's about nature much more than only people, people as part of a wider nature. But if that means we acknowledge the relevance of people as individual human beings, our curricula need to acknowledge that. So it's not good enough to have Frantz Fanon and Paulo Freire and Amilcar Cabral and others on the reading list, as long as you do not translate what they say into concepts you apply in practice, in the interaction with the students, and encourage and motivate the students to pick it up and apply it themselves in their interaction with others.
Okay. Thank you. I'm afraid our time has come to the end, even if we could continue the discussion for hours, and hopefully we will have another chance to do that. So thank you for this reflections. And if there's any final word that you would like to share with our colleagues in Zambia and Tanzania, please do so before we end.
It was a long conversation, and all of those who are listening, unless they have fallen asleep, have been very patient. So my final word would simply be Asante Sana.